Thank you, Brian and Matt. I guess it was when I was I remember it was fifth or sixth grade that I had to start with my first pair of glasses. And it was in college, though, that I started wearing contacts. And since that time, I've been able to see all these years really clearly, had no problems whatsoever, until about, 6 or 9 months ago, one of the boys needed some help clipping their toenails. And so that's one of the blessings of parenthood. And when you're little, you just dream of one day being able to do that. And so that day has finally come for us. And anyway, so one of the boys needed some help clipping their toenails. And so I told them to go get me a pocket knife. And I said to go get the clippers. And I sat down beside them on the couch. And as they're beside me, I take the clippers and I go to grab their foot to see where I need to begin to cut. I can't really see it. I know there's a foot there. I can tell that there's toes there, but I just can't see that nail. And I get a little bit closer, but that doesn't help. And then all of a sudden I realize I have become my parents and my grandparents because I can see that bad boy now. But it's so far away I can't tell where to cut it. And so what I have done at this point is I've got a handful of those little cheap reading glasses. I keep some on my desk. I keep some on the nightstand. I keep some on one of the shelves in our den. And so that way, if I need to be able to see something up close, I'm able to do so and to see that clearly. It's not that I couldn't see. Rather, it is that what I really needed to see, I could not see clearly. On this day that we celebrate the resurrection of Christ and the victory that He experienced over death and the victory that He wants to share with every person on the face of the earth, what I would say to you is this, that the resurrection of Jesus in no small way is kind of like a pair of reading glasses. And it's not that you can't see anything, rather it helps you to see what you need and to see that clearly. But what exactly does Christ's resurrection really bring into focus for us? What is it that His victory over the grave helps us to see so clearly? Well, the Bible answers that question for us today in the 24th chapter of Luke. Luke chapter 24, if you would open your Bibles there with me. If you didn't bring your glasses, you can just set the Bible on the pew in front of you and you can lean back. Luke 24, and we're going to start with verse 13. You're probably familiar, many of you, with this account. And we're going to be looking at about 20 verses, but we're just going to read a few, and then we'll drop in and then walk through the remainder of the passage as our time unfolds. Luke 24, starting with verse 13, we're told that, behold, two of them, that is, two disciples of Jesus, followers of Christ, were traveling that same day to a village called Emmaus, which was 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they talked together of all these things which had happened. So it was while they conversed and reasoned that Jesus Himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were restrained so that they did not know Him. And Jesus said to them, "What kind of conversation is this that you have with one another as you walk and are so sad?" Then one whose name was Cleopas answered and said to Him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem? And have you not known the things which happened there in these days?" And Jesus said, "What things?" And at that point they began to tell Him what has happened. What you begin to see here, and as this passage unfolds, is that God, through Luke, and His giving us this post-resurrection account of Jesus' ministry, He demonstrates how Jesus' resurrection, like my reading glasses, helps us to see that which we need to and to see it clearly. But what is it that so comes into focus? What is it that we're able to see so clearly? First of all, we're able to see clearly what really matters. What really matters. So let's set the stage. At this point, hopefully you picked up on, this is that first Easter Sunday. This is a day that began with the ladies going to the tomb, fully intent on anointing the dead body of Jesus with burial spices. But they show up and the stone has been rolled away and there's an angel present, and he informs them, listen, Jesus is not here. He is risen just as he said he was going to be. And so they begin to spread this word, and word is traveling throughout Jerusalem, especially among those who have been followers of Jesus. And in verse 13, we're introduced to a couple of guys, and initially they're just referenced as two of them. Well, we know that these are not two of what had been the 12 disciples, but it's clear that these had been followers of Jesus. And since they were not part of the 12, it's logical to assume that they were part of the 120 that Jesus had earlier commissioned. And so they have left Jerusalem. They are headed down the road to Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And as they're walking, in verse 14, you are told the nature of their conversation. They're reflecting on everything that has happened in recent days. And as they're talking, somebody just kind of joins them in their journey, which would not have been especially unusual for somebody just kind of to join you along the road. And it's Jesus. It's the resurrected Jesus. But for some reason, and we don't know, we can speculate as to why, they at this point don't recognize who he is. And though they had been his followers and they had spent time with him, heard him, witnessed him, observed him, at this point they just don't recognize who he is. And in verse 17, Jesus asks them a question. He says, so I've heard you guys talking. I've listened to your conversation. Why is it that you guys are so sad? Why are your faces so despondent? Why is the mood so heavy? And they're shocked. And they ask Jesus in verse 18, one of them, only one of them is named. One named Cleopas says, are you the only stranger in Jerusalem? I mean, now keep in mind that what has been going on in Jerusalem has been the celebration of the Passover, and the place would have been packed. I mean, if you were a Jew in good health, you were going to make your way to Jerusalem for this most important, most sacred of celebrations in the Jewish calendar. And so the place would have been packed with so many people and so many unfamiliar faces to you, and they're like, are you the only stranger in Jerusalem that doesn't know what has happened? And Jesus says, what things? And at that point, they begin to recount to Jesus what has happened. And they begin to describe what has happened over the past few days. And they probably began to say things, like we had, some number of months ago, we got introduced to this guy named Jesus, and we had heard people talking about him, and we went to hear him speak one day, and the authority with which he spoke and the content of what he said, it just pierced our hearts. And we had seen him before our eyes perform miracles, and we recognized this is somebody that we need to commit our lives to and following. And we were so excited when he came into Jerusalem just a week ago on Sunday. When he came into the city, everybody seemed to be so excited, and they were so enthusiastic to see Jesus. So many were waving palm branches and saying, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. They were even taking their coats off and stretching them on the path so that the donkey's hooves would not touch the ground. People seemed to be so excited to see Jesus, but I don't know what happened. That was Sunday, and by the time we got to Thursday, everybody that seemed to be so happy to see him, the only thing they were happy about was getting rid of him. And for some reason, though he had done nothing wrong, they demanded his execution, and Pilate finally ordered that he be crucified, killed by hanging on a cross. And they did that on Friday, and he was crucified. And they took his body down and they put it in a tomb. And we've heard some stories this morning. People are saying that he's alive. These ladies went and the body wasn't there, something about an angel. It seems pretty clear at this point, though, that Cleopas and his friend, they think if Jesus' body is gone, the only reason that it's not there is perhaps because somebody has been able to successfully take it. There is no thought in their mind that Jesus is actually alive. But though I believe that's part of the reason for their despondency, in verse 21, you see the real reason as to why they were so sad. They say to Jesus, "We were hoping that it was He who was going to redeem Israel." We were hoping that He was the one that was going to redeem Israel. Now, when it uses words like redeem and redeem Israel, on the surface you may think that sounds kind of spiritual, that they had real kind of godly spiritual aspirations in mind for Jesus. But there's nothing spiritual about what they were hoping for. When they say that it was our hope, they were expressing to Jesus, listen, our desire, our dream, our aspiration, what we were really hoping for is that Jesus would finally come and do what we have been hoping for a long time. That somehow He would kick the Romans out, that He might raise up an army, He could become a general, maybe become our first real king in a long time, and He could kick the Romans out. We could say goodbye to Caesar and his taxes and to the Roman soldiers and all that stuff. We could be through with that, and once again we could be Israel, an independent sovereign nation, respected and even feared among the nations of the world. That's what we were hoping for Jesus. And we're sad now because that's not going to happen. It's tough to have Jesus as our general when they killed Him. It's tough to have Jesus as our king when He was buried a few days ago. That's why we're so sad. What is so clear to us, though, is that we recognize that none of those were the reasons for which Jesus came. He did not come to be a teacher, a dispenser of compassion, a miracle worker, someone that would speak with profound authority. Though He did all of those things, we understand because we've got the rest of the story, that's not ultimately why He came. Jesus came to lay His life down for sinners. Jesus came to live so that He could die. Jesus came to die so that we could live. But at this point, Cleopas and his friend, they just don't get it. What is their focus? What is their hope for themselves, for their people? That somehow we're going to get us a new general, we're going to have a victorious army, we're going to become a nation respected among the nations of the world again. But after encountering the resurrected Jesus, they come to discover that that really doesn't matter. What I would say to you, that's what the resurrected Jesus does. That's what having an experience with a living Christ does. And that is that it helps you to see what truly, genuinely matters. In my years of pastoring now, I have conducted 111 funerals. And that means that 111 times I have stood before a gathering of friends and grieving family members. Some of these friends and family even seated in this room looking at a casket stretched right in front of me or an urn placed on this table and looking at that through eyes clouded with tears. 111 times I have done that, and that means that also that many times I have also met with families, grieving families. And yes, part of the purpose was to plan a service and to get their stories and make sure that we have a service that's in keeping with their desires and the nature of the person that died. But one of the reasons, though, beyond that I want to be there is just to, in whatever way I can, be a comfort and encouragement to them. But it's interesting, in all of those times that I have met with all these families, that there's not been a single time when we're dealing with this subject and we're talking about their loved one that has died, they're not concerned about whether they got the pre-emergent out on their grass in time. They're not talking about that. They're not talking about, I don't know what's going on with tech stocks lately. They've just really been taking a beating in the stock market, and the NASDAQ's really been getting hammered this week. They're not talking about, I wonder if the house is going to sell, and I wonder if that promotion is going to come through. I wonder if my kids are going to be able to excel in sports in such a way that they're able to get a scholarship. They're not talking about any of that stuff. But you know what they're talking about? Their loved one that has died and whether they'll actually see them again or not. Sometimes we get to a point and to a place that we recognize that it's not the stuff of life that really matters, but it's life itself. Prior to them experiencing a resurrected Jesus, Cleopas and his friend, their concern really is with the stuff of life. It's with generals and kings and nations and governments and taxes, the stuff of life. But encountering a risen Savior, a resurrected Jesus, the clouds begin to dissipate. And they're going to come, as we see this passage unfold, to realize it's not the stuff of life that matters. It's really life. Because they were going to experience what every single one of us is going to experience. We've got a limited amount of time on this earth. The clock is ticking for us. It's ticking for you. Every single one of us has an appointment with death, and when that time comes, it's not going to be of concern to you. Investment positions and portfolio collections and vacations that you go on, or cars that you drive, or homes that you have had. What's going to really matter at that point is life and continuing to experience it. A resurrected Jesus helps us to see that's what matters most. It's not the stuff of life. It's not that those things are unimportant, that we shouldn't care about them, but rather what matters most is not the stuff of life, but life itself. Jesus' resurrection helps us to see clearly what really matters. But beyond that, his resurrection also helps us to see what God has been up to all along. It brings into crystal clear focus what God has been up to all along. They have just shared with Jesus what all has gone on in recent days. They have recounted what happened the previous week and even what had gone on that morning. And they describe in verse 22, yes, certain women of our company who arrived at the tomb early, they astonished us, and they had described this vision of angels. And they're telling Jesus, people are saying about Jesus that he's been resurrected. And after hearing all of this, Jesus doesn't respond and say, well, that's nice, thank you for sharing. He actually rebukes them. He chides them. You see it in verse 25. He says, O foolish ones and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. And then verse 26, he says, ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and to enter his glory? In essence, in verse 26, Jesus is saying, you know what, didn't it have to happen this way? I know you guys are sad. I know you're despondent. I know your spirits are discouraged. But didn't it have to happen this way? And in verse 27, Jesus uses this as a teaching moment. And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Jesus takes them back to the Old Testament. He starts with Moses, and he begins to walk through all the prophets that followed and sharing with them. Do you remember what Moses said, what Isaiah said, what Amos said, what Joel said? Do you remember what all these prophets have said about the one who was to come? He's trying to help them see, Jesus was the fulfillment of those. That he's a tangible demonstration that God has kept his promises. He helped them to see that all the things that were said about him before he came, what he would do, and the things that he would accomplish. But at this point, Cleopas and his friend, they still don't get it. But the truth is, there's a lot of people today that still don't get it. And maybe as I continue to describe this, you would say, you know what, I'm kind of part of that group as well. Because there's a lot of people that really love stuff from the New Testament. They love these gospel stories and these stories about Jesus and the miracles and about love and about compassion, about forgiveness, about family, and all these positive things. And it's so attractive to us. But then, by comparison, people don't necessarily share the same passion and enthusiasm for the Old Testament. They say, you know, I just don't quite get it. And I go back and I read these passages out of the Old Testament, and I see all these laws and these rules and these expectations. And I read about these sacrifices and offerings and all this blood. I just don't quite get it. It seems almost as if there's a God of the Old Testament and a God of the New Testament. I don't see somehow how these two things jive. I think in no small way, that's the feeling of Cleopas and his friend that day. But what I would say to you is that I believe the resurrection of Jesus helps make sense and bring clarity to this matter and help us to see what God has been up to all along. You know, we start with Genesis, with the creation of the world and the creation of man and woman, and God puts Adam and Eve into absolute perfect paradise. I mean, there's no clocks, there's no watches, because time doesn't matter, because they weren't going to die. They weren't going to get sick. They weren't going to experience disease. None of that. Every need that they had, God was going to supply either indirectly through the provision of the garden or through Himself. They had this amazing intimacy with God where every night they could walk with Him throughout the garden and just talk with God face to face. Amazing intimacy. But God made them as volitional creatures, that they had a will and an opportunity to make decisions and choices. And when granted the opportunity to make a decision, they decided, you know what, we're going to disobey what God said. And in doing so, their disobedience was the first sin. And that sin, their sin, affected not only the created world and the earth itself, but everything and everyone that followed. You know, for Adam and Eve, the first thing that it meant for them is that they got kicked out of the garden. And as they were kicked out of the garden, all of a sudden time began to matter, because at that point they began to have a limited amount of time to live. Not only they, but all who would follow, we then at that point have a lifespan. And not only was the world itself affected and the creation itself affected, but spiritually they were affected, because they and all who followed became separated from God. But the reality is that God didn't want us, any of us, to be separated from Him. He wanted us to know of Him and ultimately to know Him. So the plan was simple, and you see this going back to the Old Testament, that God wanted to reveal Himself to the world through a people, specifically the nation of Israel, that He was going to reveal Himself to the world through them. And as He did so and revealed Himself, beginning with Moses, He gives and codifies His expectations, these rules, so that we come to understand this is what God expects. These are His standards, and when I violate it, that's sin, and sin separates me from God. And the only way that that sin can be covered at all is through the shedding of blood, through a sacrifice. And then the prophets, as they continued to come generation after generation, they were painting the picture in no small detail that all of this was going to be temporary until just the right time that God was going to bring into the world the ultimate solution and the ultimate sacrifice. Of course, we know that the ultimate solution, sacrifice, was Jesus. And His death on the cross became the final necessary sacrifice to cover my sin and yours and the person beside you and the sin of the world. So His death paid the penalty for sin, but then the other thing that He accomplished was to be resurrected from the grave, experiencing victory over death. And He offers both of these to us: forgiveness for our sin and victory over death as a free gift. What I'm saying to you is this: the resurrected Jesus helps us to look back and see all of that and how those pieces began to fit together. And that it's not an Old Testament with some crazy, maniacal, bloodthirsty, mean God. In the New Testament, it's this big, warm teddy bear that just doles out tulips and hugs to everybody. But it's the same God with the same plan all along. And that is that paradise has been lost, and ultimately paradise is going to be restored. That people became separated from God, and ultimately He wants to bring them back into Himself. That this has been part of the plan of God all along. And what I'm saying to you is that the resurrection helps us to see clearly just how all of that fits together. Let me see if I can illustrate it this way. We came to Gate City beginning in October of 2010. At that point, Andrew, our middle son, he had just turned 3 years old. And Andrew was our slowest to begin talking. And at 3 years old, he was talking a little bit, but still really early on in developing verbal skills. And it was tough to understand him. Those of you who were serving in the nursery at that point can say, duh. And so not only was it difficult for you, but even as his parents, those that are with him every day, it was a challenge for us early on to understand what he was saying. Now, with the passage of time, though, Andrew he's come light years in terms of his speech and his diction and his ability to communicate. The problem, though, is this. I think because Andrew started talking later than his brothers and his sister, I think there is this need now to make up for lost time. And so when he's talking to you, I mean, his mind is going 1,000 miles a minute, but his mouth can only go about 100. And so there's all these thoughts. He's trying to get out as fast as he can. And so when you're talking to Andrew, or I have even listened to him have conversations with Sunday school teachers or Awana teachers here at church, he may say something like this. So at the park in the back, I had my bike, but Daddy took the wheels off, and Nathan got in my leg hurts. And so he says that, and the volunteer is standing there looking clearly puzzled. And again, he said, so at the park in the back, I had my bike, but Daddy took the wheels off, and Nathan got in my way, and my leg hurts. So they've heard that, and they're like, okay, yeah, that's great. And hearing that, I began to explain to them. And I'll say, yeah, what he's talking about. We went over to Triad Park the other day, and there's several playgrounds. We went to the one in the back because there's this big, around the playground, a big sidewalk area. And I finally took the wheels off of, the training wheels off his bicycle, and he was riding for the first time on his bike with just 2 wheels. But he got going, and Nathan got in his way, and he fell, and in doing so, he skinned his knee. Now, we both heard the same thing, but here's the difference. Because I knew what happened, what he said makes sense. Do you get what I'm saying? Because we know what happens with the resurrection of Jesus, everything he says back here, it makes sense. And what we come to do is to see that there is this intentionally placed scarlet thread of redemption throughout the whole panoply of Scripture that reveals to us it has always been the plan of God that once we got separated from Him to bring us back into Himself so that ultimately we could spend eternity with Him. That's what the resurrection of Jesus does. It brings clarity and brings things into focus. Yeah, it helps us to see what really matters, but beyond that, to see what God has been up to all along. But there's a final thing it makes very clear for us, and that's this. It helps us very clearly to see what our task is. It helps us to see what our task is. As this passage continues to unfold, in verse 27, Jesus has just expounded all of this to them. In verse 28, they're drawing near to the village where they were going, seemingly Emmaus. And Jesus indicates he would have gone further with them, but they said, why don't you just stop? We've been walking a long way. It's evening at this point. Why don't you stop and share dinner with us? Verse 29, abide with us, for it's toward evening, and the day is far spent. And he went in to stay with them. Verse 30, now it came to pass as he sat at the table with them, he took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. Verse 30 is interesting, and this is very easily, as you're reading this passage, you can say, okay, Jesus stops at their house and he has supper with them. Very seemingly minute expression of fact, but that minute expression of fact has great theological consequence, and here it is. Jesus shares a meal with them. What's the big deal with that? Because only people with bodies can eat a real meal. That's a big deal. And I want you to understand that the entirety of the Christian faith hinges on what the Bible communicates is a literal bodily resurrection of Jesus. And think about it this way. Suppose instead of Jesus having what the Bible teaches, a literal bodily resurrection, suppose today in the year 2014 you could still go to Jerusalem and there was this garden tomb that was there that had a stone over it, and even over the years researchers had peeked inside and they could confirm that the body of Jesus was still inside. And what if for the past 2,000 years the faithful followers of Jesus have all gone to that tomb to lay flowers and to light candles and to offer prayers and do all these things, remembering the sacrifice of Jesus? And what if this entirety of time we have been telling ourselves, as perhaps some might have communicated to us, yes, Jesus' body is still there, it's still in the grave, but he had a spiritual resurrection. Leaving the body, he had a spiritual resurrection. Would you still be a follower of Jesus? I would absolutely hope not. Because that's too easy to fake. Anybody can say that. Anybody can make that up. Again, the entire Christian faith hinges on the fact of, on the truth of, on the reality of a literal bodily resurrection of Jesus. Do you understand why? Here it is. If Jesus did not experience a literal victory over death, unless Jesus' literal body came out of that grave, if that did not happen when your body goes in that grave, it will never come out. Our eternity hangs on the literal bodily resurrection of Jesus. And here in just that simple statement, we have this wonderful expression of fact that communicates Jesus was resurrected, bodily and spiritually. Jesus was resurrected. Now, after this, verse 31, we're told that their eyes were open and they knew him. All of a sudden, the light goes off. Man, that's Jesus. And as soon as they recognize that, Jesus is gone. Now, verse 31, verse 32, they said to one another, "Did not our heart burn within us while he talked with us on the road and while he opened the scriptures to us?" And so they began to reflect on their conversation, the time that they've had with Jesus, and they're like, man, yeah, he helped us to see what really mattered. And it's not all this junk about kings and governments and taxes and Caesar and Rome and all that stuff. What really mattered was this problem and the need for life. And he helps us to see that going back to the earliest days of the Old Testament, this has been the plan of God, and he is the fulfillment of the plan of God. Man, that burned. It was so convincing to us and so significant to us. But then we're told that in verse 33, so they rose up at that very hour and returned to Jerusalem. Now, what time of day is it? Well, it's nighttime, because they've just asked Jesus, said, listen, it's late in the day, it's evening, why don't you share a meal with us? It's already night. There's no street lights, there's no flashlights, there's none of that stuff. So it's dark, and so they decide we need to go to Jerusalem, and we need to find the 11. So the 11 remaining disciples, and we need to tell them about what we've experienced. And so they leave where they are, and they've got to travel 7 miles, and they don't have the added benefit of a car, they don't have flashlights. It's going to be lanterns and torches, and they've got to go 7 miles. You know, I generally walk about 7 miles a month. But they were going to do that in an evening after it was already dark. And I don't imagine it was like just a shuffling. I think these guys were booking it. I think they were just going as fast as they possibly could to get back to Jerusalem. And as they get back, they find where the disciples are. And you read the description in verse 34. Let me tell you how, first of all, I don't think this happened. I don't believe they kind of sauntered into Jerusalem and found the house, the building, wherever the disciples were, and just politely rang the doorbell and stood back. Or maybe Peter comes to the door. John comes to the door. Well, good evening. The Lord is risen indeed. Kind of like Lurch. You rang. I don't think at all that that's how that happened. And And obviously, I think we have to look at that statement, the Lord is risen indeed, and think about what's going on and get a sense of the enthusiasm. I think they ran as fast as they possibly could. I think they were out of breath. I think they were probably about to pass out, but they were saving that last bit of strength to say to the disciples, Jesus is alive. We walked with him. We talked with him. What you've heard about Peter, that's exactly the case. Jesus is alive. They're so excited. They're telling people about the risen Jesus. But there's a couple of things that are noteworthy about this. These become the first evangelists of the New Testament, or among the first evangelists of the New Testament. And they're telling people about the resurrected Jesus. But notice this, they're telling people about the resurrected Jesus before they're ever commanded to do so. It's not until you get to verse 47 of this chapter that Jesus gives to his disciples, not only to those that were gathered, but to all who followed since then, the commandment to tell people about him. And so they're doing this before they're ever commanded to. But the simple reality is that's how it ought to be, shouldn't it? You know, it's unfortunate to think that God had to give us a command to tell others what we've experienced when, quite frankly, it ought to come so naturally. I mean, you may have a foot procedure this coming week and get a corn removed, and you may tell a dozen people about it. We'll talk to them about the Panthers, or we'll talk to them about a primary race or whatever, but we won't tell them about we've experienced a real encounter with Jesus that has changed our lives and is changing where we spend eternity. They're sharing before they were commanded to do so. But the other thing I want you to notice is their method of sharing. Did they stop on their way to Jerusalem at a Kinko's, a UPS store, and say, man, we need some help. Can you help us design a tract? A tract of some sort. Can you put some Bible verses on it and some pictures? Because we need to tell somebody about Jesus, so we need a tract that we can use. Can you print us, give us a couple dozen copies? Did they do any of that? No. In terms of what they shared, did they share a particular witnessing strategy that they had learned, whether it was EE or it was CWT or it was the net or it was the Romans Road or it was, you pick whatever of the known taught methods of faith sharing that exist. Are they using any of those methods? No. And don't misunderstand me. I don't have a single thing against tracts or any of these varied witnessing strategies. I think they all have their place. But here's the deal. There is still no substitute for somebody who has had an experience with a living Jesus just telling somebody else about their experience. When push comes to shove, that's the greatest method of sharing. You saying, this is what Jesus has done in my life. This is how it happened for me. This is how it can happen for you. It's as simple as that, and it ought to come so amazingly naturally. It did for them, and that's how it ought to be for us. But there's one final thought I want to share with you. It's simple. They had this encounter with the resurrected Jesus, and it made their task, the task of sharing about him, so clear that they didn't even have to be told to do it. A few minutes ago, I talked about Andrew being our slowest to talk. Philip is our youngest son. He just turned 5, or as he describes, a full hand. Anyway, Philip was not our latest to talk. He was probably the first to talk. And when Big Phil started talking, he has not stopped. And this child loves to talk to any and everybody. He has sincerely yet to meet a stranger. We were at the park one day, and Philip even asked somebody whom he had never met or spoken to, "Are you a stranger?" They said, "Well, to you, yes, but that didn't stop him. He continued to talk." But it's interesting and it's fun to take Philip out to places because, in my estimation, he's one of the greatest evangelists and one of the greatest advocates for our church within our church. And hopefully you have used some of these or picked them up, or at the very least you're familiar with them. We have there's some business cards that have been printed up, essentially little small invite cards that we encourage our folks. You take them as you have a waitress, a cashier, anybody that you encounter. You can just very easily, very quickly share with them about your church. It's got our email address, our contact information, our website on there. Easy way to pass that out. And Big Phil always seems to have some of these with him, or if he doesn't, he'll ask me or Caroline for some of them. I remember one night back last summer, Caroline was doing something else, and I had the 4 kids. I'd taken them to the park, and we stopped at Wendy's to get a Frosty afterwards. And we were in line behind this older couple, and Philip asked me, he said, give me one of those cards. And so I gave him one of the cards, and so he tugs on their clothes, and he hands them a Gate City card, and he said, we go to Gate City Baptist Church, and I wanted to invite you to our church. And they looked at him, and they said, well, thank you so much, but we already go to a church. And then Philip says, which one? As if he knows any churches. I mean, he's 4 at the time. And so when they tell him what church they go to, and I won't tell you which one it was, but I remember. Anyway, he says when they tell him what church that they go to, he says, well, you could leave that one and go to ours. And little kids can get away with that, but it's interesting. But he's not just telling people about our church. I remember just a few weeks ago, I'd taken he and Nathan with me. I needed to go to get my car inspected, and I finally found over at the Firestone over on Friendly Avenue, they did state inspections, so we pulled in there. And when we're going in, Philip asked me for some of these cards, and they had 3 employees. And Philip went by and he invited all 3 of the employees there to church. But there was a customer seated in the waiting area with us, and Philip gives them one of these cards. He invites them to our church, and he says this. He says, at our church, we love Jesus, and Jesus died for us so that we can go to heaven. I haven't sat down with him a single time and said, you ought to say this. Not a single time have I said, how about saying something like this to them? But even at his young age, he's had an experience with Jesus that makes it so clear and so natural what ought to come out. You know what? Shouldn't it be that way? It absolutely ought to, because the resurrected Jesus makes it so clear. He helps us to see what really matters, that it's not the stuff of life. It's life itself, and how limited this physical life is, and that we've got an appointment with death for which he is the only solution. He helps us to see that this has been part of the plan of God to solve this problem for me and for you and for all who have ever lived throughout the course of history, that paradise lost is one day going to be paradise restored, that people separated will once again be united with him. And that when you experience this, and isn't it interesting, there's a progression of thought in this passage. You come to see your need, you come to see the solution of God, and once you experience that, you share it. It's how it ought to be. But what I'm saying to you in short is this. The resurrected Jesus makes every bit of that crystal clear. But then again, that's what Jesus does. He makes everything so clear. My question for you today very simply is this. Can you, have you, do you see it? Won't you bow your heads with me?